Helguera. I'm an assistant professor in the art history department, and I'm very happy to welcome everyone here tonight for what is really our second headliner visiting artist and scholar series. I wanted to thank the School of Arts and Communication, the Department of Art and Art History for helping make this happen. We are very excited, and I think everyone really enjoyed our last speaker, Tim Rollins. Had some good time with him. Today's speaker is just as excellent. Pablo Helguera had a chance to work with some of the seniors in the department today, as well as spend this evening with us. I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Lieslot van der Heijden to introduce him and tell a little bit about his background. Thank you.
So welcome everybody to tonight's lecture. It's hosted by the Department of Art and History, and thank you all very much for coming and being here. I would like to start thanking TCJ, especially the author, to make this meeting possible tonight. And also, of course, Professor Ellen and all the others who have helped to make this whole occasion so tonight. Tonight's speaker is Pablo Helguera. He is born in Mexico City, and he is a New York-based artist who works, and I have to read because there's so much that he's doing that it's impossible to remember it all. He's working with installation, sculpture, photography, drawings, socially engaged art, and performance. Pablo Helguera's work focuses on a variety of topics ranging from history, pedagogy, social linguistics, ethnography, memory, and the absurd, and in formats that are widely varied, including the lecture, museum display strategies, musical performances, and written fiction. Pablo Helguera performed individually at the Museum of Modern Art, and his musical composition, Endingness, has been performed by the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. He has exhibited or performed at venues such as Musea de Arte Reina Sofia in Madrid, ICA Boston, RCA London, the 8 Havana Biennial, Performa 05, Havana, Stadthalle Zurich, MoMA PS1 in New York, Brooklyn Museum, IFA Gallery in Bonn, and on and on and on. He also is a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and a recipient of the 2005 Creative Capital Grant, and many more. In addition to being an artist, Pablo has worked since 1991 in a variety of contemporary art museums, including the Guggenheim Museum, and since 2007 he's the director of the adult and academic programs of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He has organized close to 1,000 public events in conjunction with nearly 100 exhibitions. Pablo is also an author of numerous books, and he's represented by Kent Fine Art in New York and Enrique Cuero Gallery in Mexico City. Currently, he has a solo show up at Kent Gallery in Chelsea, New York, and it's up for 2 more days. So I highly recommend, if you have a chance, to go to New York. It's still up on Thursday and Friday. And it's a beautiful exhibition, I'm sure he will discuss it in the lecture. Now, before I start, I would like to ask everyone to, as you're listening to his lecture, to come up with about 3 questions to ask him and to write them down for yourself and ask them at the end. At the end, we have an extended amount of time for Q&A, question and answers, and we really want to have a discussion with him, and I want really that you direct the topics of the discussion, so it really will depend on your questions. So please, as you're listening, have a little notebook and write down about 3 questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Lieslot, and thank you so much for having me here. My voice, can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me too much? Can you turn off this mic? I have a rule about my presentations. I always try to never repeat the same same presentation again, just because I have survived many years of listening to lecturers saying exactly the same presentation over and over again, almost in their sleep, and making everyone incredibly bored. So my goal is to at least spare you from that thing. So if it might still be boring, but at least it will be different. Different boringness. One thing that contextualizes, I guess, the things I'm going to talk to you about has to do with what people term socially engaged art. And I'm somehow partially responsible for that term, as I wrote this book called Education for Socially Engaged Art. As Lysel mentioned, I have been over 20 years working in museums and museum education. And I did it at the beginning mainly because to survive, to pay my tuition. I still do it to survive, but I still do it, but I also do it because I love it. And I also do it because I learned that museum education, or education in general, is absolutely intricate, and one of the ways in which you can really develop relationships with other people. And I believe art is about that. It's about relationships with others as much as it's also a relationship with yourself. When I started doing art, I was a painter. I was trying to be a painter. And I was very frustrated by the fact that somehow I couldn't actually communicate, I suppose, the things that I really wanted to do with my paintings. And it took me many years to figure it out, but it had to do with my experiences working with people, giving tours, teaching, things like that, realizing that, in fact, those communication things that happen when you're talking to others, and the way that people relate to art in a museum gallery are part of the context of the art experience. So I wanted to make art that was not an object to look at, but an experience to be lived. And that's why I was interested in performance art. I'm interested in art that is not necessarily just a thing that you look at, that you experience, but that is the thing. That is, the experience is the thing. And perhaps this might be a little complicated to explain, but that's why I'm here to try to describe it. Today we'll do a number of things. First, we'll start with the end, and then go backwards. This is the end because, essentially, this is my last artwork, this thing that you see here in the back. It's a game for 50 persons, for 50 participants. It's a game that is played only once in its entire existence. And it's a game that will be performed by those 50 people for their entire duration of their lives. We started this year, and it will conclude in 2097, when probably none of us will be still alive, unless you somehow manage to get to 120 years old, or 100, it's possible. I invited 25 people that were very close to me, their friends, relatives, and all of them who were much younger than me, so that they're likely to survive me. And then I also invited 25 people who were random visitors in a gallery exhibition that suddenly I asked them to engage in this lifetime commitment. So those 25 people said yes in that case. Each person received 16 envelopes, which, as a code of honor, they were supposed to open at a particular date. Each envelope had, sorry, this is a pointer. This is just a pointer. I'm going to point the other. Each envelope has a date. So you can see that if you look at the dates, you'll see that the first date was March 1st, 2014. The second envelope was opened 2 days later. The next one 4 days later. The following 8 days later, 16, 32, 64, 127. So as you can see, that the time of the envelopes duplicates as you progress in time. So days become weeks of distance, become months, become years, become decades. Probably the last envelope that I might survive from lucky to open is 2053. My daughter, who is 4 years old today, she will be 88 years old on the day when the last envelope is to be opened, which is Thanksgiving of 2097. So there's another envelope, the last envelope, which is to be read on the day that I die. So why I'm doing this? I wrote a letter for the audience that actually participated in the project and was present on the day of the event. That I will read it to you. The other thing that I should say is that each envelope has a series of instructions and things that are asked of the people to open at the time. And these get opened in this particular piece, or board, I guess. You open them as time progresses. And the names of the participants are inscribed in a little plaque with their birthdays, the date of their birth, and whoever ends up owning this object has to commit to inscribe the deceased date of each one of us when it happens. To the point that one day, perhaps in 2097 or beyond, all these people will be gone, right? So this is the letter that I wrote to the public, which, as you will see, was not really the public of the gallery, but it was a letter that I wrote to whoever will be alive in 2097, which will be the day in which the last envelope of this work is to be opened. Ladies and gentlemen of 2097, after having spoken at so many events throughout my life, I have never spoken at an event where the audience doesn't exist yet. This is because tonight's event is not only for us in this gallery. It is also for a hypothetical audience, most of which has not yet been born. They will be closer to the generation of our grandchildren, or to our great-grandchildren, if we are lucky to have descendants. It is almost certain that not a single one of us present tonight will be alive on the evening of November 23rd, 2097. Exactly 84 years after today. My own daughter, who is 3 years old today, is still alive, will be 88 years old then. We are a lifetime away from that point. It is difficult to imagine what the world will be like. If it's going to be a happy place, if it might become irreparably destroyed by a wasteful society. But in the same way that we can't know what the future holds and what we could learn from those hypothetical audiences of the future that will watch the video of this event, we are making now for them. It is also interesting that we are sometimes equally ignorant about those who lived in the past. I often think of it when I look at a 19th century portrait of a great-great-grandmother of mine, La Abuela Luisa, of which I know practically nothing, other than what she was the grandmother of my grandfather and lived in the city of Zacatecas in Mexico. She left no letters or objects, and there are no photographs of her other than that painting. Historical records and witness accounts often help us to piece together the past, but it never provides a full insight. So those who lived, say, in the 1920s are equally distant to us than we are from those people who will exist in 2097. So this recorded message from us is to them. It might not be a magic insight we can convey to you, now I'm speaking to those of you on the other side. What you might find most paradoxical is that our time may be most readable to you than to us who are living it now. But in any case, how great it would have been for us if the voices of the past had consciously attempted to speak to us directly. If my abuela Luisa, for instance, would have written me a letter and tried to make specific efforts to reach out to us and let us know what mattered to them the most. This is what at least we can do for you, the future audiences. We can write to you, we can speak to you now, hoping that you might listen later. We can attempt to salvage the natural boundaries of human lifetimes by employing a bit of artifice in the form of a conceptual artwork, something that we invented and that might not even exist by the end of the century. But it is important also to say that we are also writing and speaking to another hypothetical and not yet existing audience, which is ourselves in 20 or 30 years. We might find that we were very different people from what we became later, that we might have forgotten who we once were. It is thus not only the potential of a conversation with you, but with those whom we might become along the way. This is why I have created this game to be played once, consisting in 15 envelopes, which will be opening over the years by the living and willing participants. Each envelope is dated and scheduled to be opened twice the amount of time as the previous one. The gap will be first in days, in months, in years, and decades. One envelope is scheduled to be opened at my own passing, hopefully several decades from now, if I am lucky. After I am gone, and hopefully if you outlive me, I will be continue to speak to you from what is contained in those envelopes, should you choose to continue your promise to keep them and open them at a given time. I will ask the visitors of tonight's event to write a private note to the audiences of 2097, which will go in a time capsule that will be opened on that date, hopefully by these hypothetical audiences. Were I not able to come to be alive in 2093, 97, which is most likely, I would ask those of you who can do so to come and open it. I wish I could say I will be there in spirit, but I don't believe in that which is not tangible. I do believe in art. I believe in the perseverance and in the perseverance of ideas, and I believe in the constancy of people and the bonds they create, which is what compels me to propose the current collective experience. So let's celebrate that bond that we have now created. Let's take a photograph for you, the audiences of 2097, that they will be able to see, knowing that we took them for you, so that you know how we looked, how strangely we dressed and spoke, how innocent perhaps we looked, but that we were here for you and for our descendants. To open that last envelope with the things that we wrote tonight, and as you open that last envelope, it will bring finally to completion an experience that lasted 84 years this evening at a small art gallery. The reason why I read this is to give you an example of a work that, in a way, addresses a lot of concerns that I currently have, which is, it has to do, as you might have figured, with time, with memory, and with the relationship between individuals. And how, in a way, in the day and age that we live today, where we are so interconnected in such a fast and quick manner, through social media and such, yet those connections start feeling very meaningless, at least to me, I feel that the more we are connected, the less we seem to be really in touch with each other. Which is, I think, one of the great ironies of our time. I've been always very interested in producing works that try to create bonds between people, that try to make people give a heightened sense of reality, of the experience of being alive, and to see themselves in their present in a meaningful capacity, that they're able to read themselves through others and have a meaningful interconnection with others. And I feel that art today can create beautiful aesthetic experiences, where we can make a beautiful artwork that people can admire. but I do think that we as artists have, in a certain way, a certain responsibility to use what we know as tools that are generally known as art to make people aware of their surroundings in a critical way and in an introspective way as well. And to me, socially engaged art is about that. It's about creating those experiences that enhance communication between individuals. Whether it has an urgent political message, or it prompts more of a larger philosophical reflection of our lives, or anything like that. So I'll just to give you another example of another piece that I made a few years ago, which is very, very different. It does kind of follow similar rationale, I guess. A couple of friends of mine who live in New York, city where I live, they opened a little alternative space in Chinatown. If you have been to Chinatown, you will know it's very densely packed part of the city, where there's tons of little stores and shops and things. So they rented a very tiny space, almost like a closet, called Forever and Today, and just a very beautiful name, I thought. And they asked me, would you like to do a project here? And I said, of course, yes. But here you go, it's like a tiny microscopic space, It's in New York real estate. I looked at the neighborhood and I was like, well, what could you possibly do in a place like this? And one thing that has always been interesting to me, not only in New York, but in many other cities, these places where they read your hand, your palm, right? Palm readings, which if you have seen them, usually is a window with a lady, usually dressed in some kind of I don't know, like some turban or some kind of thing, like something exotic, and then maybe a crystal ball and some like weird images around her, and she's going to read your future and so forth. So I thought that I would do such a place, and I will charge just $1, which is actually pretty cheap. Usually they charge you a ton of money, about $10 at least. And I also created my own set of cards. It's a tarot style card, but this is not tarot. I invented my own system, which I called the 7 Bridges of Königsberg. The 7 Bridges of Königsberg, it was inspired on an anecdote, well, not an anecdote, but a real historical fact, which is in Germany, or what it used to be actually, Russia, Kaliningrad, there used to be 7 bridges in this little town. There was a mathematical problem about the 7 bridges of Königsberg that posed whether it was possible to create a route through which you could cross all 7 bridges in a single path without having to recross any of them. This sounds much more simple than what it is. It's actually an incredibly complicated mathematical problem that in the end it was solved by Thomas Euler, who was one of the greatest minds of the 18th century of mathematics, and he proved that it was impossible. And by creating the proof that it was impossible, he created essentially what is one of the main theorems that founded systems theory, which is in turn that created computers. So the 7 Bridges of Königsberg proposed that no life had a single path, and that you can never really recross a bridge, in the same way that you can never really recross any path of your own life. Now, as an educator, one thing that I learned about museums is that whenever I'm talking to people about an artwork, whatever is the context under which I present the artwork, changes completely what they might perceive about it. If, for example, we pass through the exhibition and they see this bottle of water, they might not think anything about it. But if I say, this was the bottle of water that Madonna was like drinking when she did whatever, like people will comment that. In other words, it's images, the context that you provide images is very, very important. And when I show an image like this and tell you this is a random card I did, you might think whatever. But if I say, for example, this card represents your childhood, I think you might have a little bit of a, kind of like, what's the deal with the broken nose in my childhood, So the 7 Bridges to Königsberg was a system through which started, it was a series of provocations that made people talk. And another thing I learned as an educator is that you teach not by giving people, by dumping information on people, by talking at people, but by helping them articulate the things that they are experiencing or that they already know, but they have really quite articulated in a form that it has filtered through them. In other words, I would many times, or most of the time, just kind of reconfigure things that people were already telling me, and by telling them back to them, for people would be like a revelation. It was a really interesting process through which, I got like tons of people from all walks of life, from a woman who came almost every single day for me to have a card reading for her, and actually she was having problems with her neighbors. She had like a paranoia with her neighbors. A person who was gay who was finally coming out. A war veteran from Iraq that wanted to become a singer and move to Paris. In the end, during the session, decided that that's it. It was moving to Paris. And so many different people who would suddenly confess incredibly personal things about their lives. It was kind of like the therapy session, and the other thing that was important, I think, for this project is that I would tell people immediately that this was an art project. And that actually did not matter very much to anybody. Because even when, I think if you are interested, whenever you have played a game, perhaps you will know this, when you play a game, it's a game. It's not for real. And yet, when you get hooked on a game, the moment of being hooked on the game is a moment of complete immersion in the game, where you're not, it's like being immersed in a dream, where you're not really saying, oh, I'm in a dream. Or even if you say you're in a dream, it doesn't really matter. What matters is what you're experiencing in that moment. In that moment, the experience is real. It's as important, or it's as valid as important as if it was real life. And that's something that's really important, I think, to think about art making. Many times we make works accepting that we can exist in the confinement, in the social confinement of what is art. And by that I mean is we exhibit in very conventional environments like galleries and museums and so forth. And we accept the frames of that place where we work. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that we live in a world that, especially in a country like this, for which art is almost equated completely with entertainment. So if you say you are an artist, you're also kind of like an entertainer. And what does an entertainer do? Well, it makes us feel good, makes us feel relaxed. Except that art is not about just making you feel good or relaxed. Art's about asking also hard questions. It's about pushing the envelope. It's about helping you rethink and reconfigure the reality we're in. And if you cannot do that with art, then you have accepted to exist on a range of art making that is really about complacency. And I think that's a really unfortunate place to be as an artist, when you have the capability to do much more to change things in the world. So this has been a constant concern of mine, I guess, and it has, in many ways, pushed me to pursue, I guess, more alternative means of making artworks. As I was in museums, I was looking at how artists were making what you then call institutional critique, works that were political, works that were about identity politics, or that were about struggles, social struggles. The problem was that these things were in museums. And the problem also was that you will walk into the museum and see a work that is political, and you say like, yeah, it's a big deal. Political art, walk away. You know, you vote with your feet and you leave the museum. And if you don't really want to see that thing, you never have to come to the museum, ever. You can ignore museums for your entire life, you know, and that's great for the person, but maybe not for art, you know. So, and I felt that there are very urgent issues that cannot afford the complacency again of existing within the confines of what somebody said. Okay, you crazy guys, artists, you know, just go inside this cube and just do whatever crazy thing you do, but do it there. Don't mess up our organized, perfect world, you know. So I completely refuse to do that. And here's an example of one of them. So in Mexico City, this is 10 years ago, okay? Long time. Rudolph Giuliani was kind of, you know, I think finally he had left for mayor. I can't remember. I think he finally had finished his mayoralty. And Mexico City had hired him to become an advisor, you know. And at that moment, still to an extent, the government was very right-wing, and the cultural policy of the city was very conservative. And to me, this was like the last straw. And then I emailed the curator there and said, like, this is unbelievable, and that we have to do something about it. And the curator was was game for some kind of intervention, you know. And he said, well, just propose something. This guy ran a performance festival. So I said, well, I want to do something, but I don't want it to be part of I don't want it to be even promoted as part of the festival, and I don't want it in the museum. I want that we actually do it elsewhere. And he was totally fine with it, which was amazing. Only in Mexico City. So what I did is I did a symposium, which was called Primer Congreso Internacional de Planificación Cultural Urbana, which means First International Congress of Urban Cultural Purification of Mexico City. So what it was, I sent a call for papers saying Mexico City is a polluted city, a lot of smog, but it's also culturally polluted. A lot of crap out there, you know. We are looking for papers to see how we can purify culturally our city. Which, you know, if you did that in 1936, you would say you're a fascist or you're a Nazi, you know. But you do this in Mexico City in 2003, and no one says anything, you know. And everybody says, like, ah, what a good idea. So I got dozens of papers, people proposing how to culturally purify the city. And then what I did, I wrote 6 papers myself, and I invited actors to learn them. You know, I brought people from elsewhere, from the US, from New York, that nobody knew in Mexico City. And we were sequestered in a friend's apartment, rehearsing our papers. You know? And the papers were responses, very radical responses to these other papers. Okay? So we organized the conference at a hotel, at a convention center. So it was a completely neutral place. And because I work in museums and education, and people saw me organizing this event, nobody really thought much about that fact, that I was the organizer of the event. You know, not a single person suspected it was a performance piece. We did it very well. We organized with, you know, typical conference style, you know, with like, everybody's like name tags and registration. We did a lot of papers and it was really an enormous project, you know, with volunteers helping and everything. And so we show up to the first session. You know, it was a day-long symposium. Okay, lasted from 9 to 6, and I mean it was one of the most stressful days of my life. You know, because essentially it was pulling off like a complete how to say it? Depends how you see it. But in fact, so the other thing is that very importantly, I invited the people who the people who submitted the papers to read their papers. So there were real presenters who did not know that they would be presenting next to actors their papers. So, for example, there was a guy who was reading a paper on, you know, classical culture, And then I had another person writing something like saying, well, contemporary art is incomprehensible, it's stupid, it's for 10 people, it should be forbidden. You know, if classical culture is the real culture that we should all learn. And we should really only learn about great culture because that's the only thing that really matters. You know? Because the other culture kind of, I mean, so it was essentially an anti-multiculturalist attitude, which was kind of terrifying. You know? But what was most interesting was that some people started in the audience saying, yeah, that sounds like really interesting. And then a populist that would say, well, only popular culture matters. Like high culture is just for the elite, and it's, you know, it should be eradicated. So from the very beginning, the debates became unbelievably strong, and people immediately started reacting in ways that you never see people react in panel or symposiums. And I can tell you this because I have organized, like, as I said, more than 1,000. And I am deeply exhausted and exasperated by the meaninglessness of most of these events. The second panel, I was the moderator, and a friend of mine who was from Austria, she came and she read a paper about education in Mexico. Her paper was an impeccable scholar paper that we spent months researching and writing. She obviously knows absolutely nothing about Mexico, by the way, you know, like my actual fact. And she read a paper about education in Mexico and saying that the last meaningful education reform in Mexico was in 1920, you know, providing the proof, which is, there's a certain, like, interesting, I mean, it's very ironic and cynical attitude, but there's some truth in some things that she said. Then a friend of mine who was sitting to her right, who was an actor, he was acting as a local politician. So he basically attacked her, saying, well, you are like this blonde European who knows nothing about Mexico, and you come here to tell us about education. So the audience completely turned against him, saying, well, you're a politician who knows nothing about education in your city. Who are you to tell her anything? So it became an incredibly contentious session. And the two real presenters, you can see how worried they are about what's going on. They're freaking out. You know? The final session was the top of everything. And I have a friend of mine who's a performance artist named Brian Hill. He's down there, the guy in the right corner. He was in the session, and another friend of mine, Marco Barzols, who's a curator, who did present as himself, but he wasn't in the know. Marco did the anarchist take, saying, you know, all institutions, all cultural institutions are a disaster. We should just completely eliminate all art institutions and give the money to the artists. And it was a very good argument. And then Ryan came at the end. And he posed as a supporter of Rudolph Giuliani, an American, obviously, who had some sort of, I mean, at that time it was not a PAC, but it was similar, you know, kind of an organization for the presidential election of Rudolph Giuliani. And his proposal was that essentially the US should administer Mexican culture. Which in Mexico, you can imagine what to say that is like. People were crying in the audience. Somebody at some point said, I cannot believe we're talking about this thing, that we have arrived to this moment, to this place, you know. So we left in that note, you know, and with the discussion, and we did not reveal what had happened. Yet a critic, an art critic, suspected something was up. And the next day, there was a huge uproar in the press. We were in all papers, especially about the presentation of Ryan Hill, about the Department of State taking over the culture, you know. And eventually I was confronted by one of the critics about whether this had been a performance. And I actually, at the time, did not. But my response was, well, why do you need to know on whether something that somebody said at a public event was meant to be a performance or not? What does it really matter if you say something outrageous that you have a PhD from La Sorbonne or that you are nobody? You know? In other words, there was a huge push at that moment to actually encase again, as we always do with art, everything into a frame, into a little box, into saying, oh, here's a film about the war, but it's just a film. I can walk out of the film, I can walk out of the museum, I can close the book, and continue living my life the way I want. But what was going on here was that it was an involuntary, certainly, transgression with the public, but that was forcing a conversation that I felt was very necessary, and that did finally occur in the press after the event took place. So, so this is what I mean when I talk about breaking those frames of art, you know, and this has, of course, necessitated the act of blurring fact and fiction, and blurring where the art starts and where it ends. And yet I think that that's precisely the kind of thing that, the kind of tensions that art today should be pursuing, or at least reflecting upon. I will mention another related example. This one has to do with, sorry guys, I'm gonna have to turn this off. So I need to lose the sound. Okay, there we go. So, a few years, well, several years later, I was invited to do a project with an organization in Kansas City called Grand Arts. And I wanted to do something that was specifically for the art world, for the art makers themselves, that kind of reflected on our own condition of art making today. And this Kansas City environment was like the perfect opportunity, I thought, to do that. Grand Arts is a wonderful organization that supports artist projects that can be big scale and so forth. And usually you can build a giant sculpture or, like, I don't know, some crazy idea, you know. What I told them was that I wanted actually to do a play. And they were like, oh, really? A play? Why do you want to do a play? You want to build like a big sculpture or something? Painting, you're wrong. No, I'm going to do a play. But anyway, so what we did in the end was a retrospective of a fictional artist without telling anybody that he was fiction. And the name of the guy was Juvenal Merst. A guy who had died, supposedly, 7 years ago. And this piece is called October. It's like an October magazine with a bunch of hot air coming out of it. So Juvenal Merst, his name Juvenal, I don't know if you guys know who Juvenal was, but he was a famous Latin poet who is known as the father of satire. So there's something there, right? So this anti-feminist piece here by Juvenal Merst. Everything he did was against something. He hated everything. This is a porn piece. You know, it has a porn movie from the 80s, 70s. You know, I don't know. He just had like a piece on time. This was an anti-New York piece. Whatever. Everything was like he was against everything. Right? Porn piece. But what was really more important was that on the day of the opening, we had a panel discussion. It was a symposium celebrating the life of Juvenal Merst. At the opening, the visitors, or people in Kansas City, got to know the Juvenal Merst art world, let's say. You know? The collector, there had been a Juvenal Merst collector for many years, the ex-boyfriend, the ex-girlfriend, who's there, this art historian who had theorized about the work of Merst for many years. And that's it. And then there was a guy who was moderating, who was kind of a very slimy guy, who had an opportunist who basically had cashed in on Juvenal Merst's work at the end of his life. And he had been a scholar, but he had been kind of, he had lost tenure at the university, and he was kind of a disgraced scholar. And he became an art consultant. And then he started making a lot of money, selling work to the collector. So all these people who actually were hanging out in Kansas City from the days before they were, of course, actors that I had trained. They didn't knew, at the beginning of the process, they knew absolutely nothing about art. You know, so we had to train them. And you know, the nice thing to work with real professional actors is that they, when they're good, they can be better and more real than the real person, you know. So, but their transformation was unbelievable. Like the collector, for example, this actor, she had not really a lot of great taste in her dress, and she had cheap clothes. So we bought her really expensive clothes, Prada, whatever we could find in the thrift shop. The most expensive thing we could buy, and we dressed her very well. And then she really, at the end, was incredible. She was like Aggie Gunt. I don't know if you guys know who Aggie Gunt is. You can Google Aggie Gunt. The symposium starts, and by this moment, absolutely nobody suspects that this is a fiction. And our goal that we spent months and months and months rehearsing with professional theater director, I worked with a theater co-director, was to be able to maintain the fiction up to the last minute. You know, that this was like a real panel discussion. So the premise of the whole play, or the symposium that is that these people that haven't seen each other, that were all connected very intimately with juvenile mirths, are coming together 7 years later per request of the artist to talk about him. So they all come, and everything starts very nicely, and they start like niceties, and everybody, you know, very nice. But within 5 minutes, you realize that they do not agree in absolutely anything, and that their ideas of who juvenile was completely different. Someone says he's a minimalist, and the one says like he has nothing to do with minimalism because of political artist. And it turns out that in reality, they all hate each other, and they start insulting each other, and things get really out of control. So I'm going to play to you around 3 minutes of one of the scenes of the Juvenile Players.
The artist said, look at the works. Where is the politics in these works?
Which brings me to your book, Clifford. Since now that we are telling each other what we really think about everything, I don't even know where to begin. Clifford, your book is so full of inaccuracies that I'm just surprised you had the nerve to publish it.
Oh, now we're going to get a whole stall.
No, I'm serious. It is unbelievable. First you discuss the work as if he would be some modernist like Mondrian, and if he would have never done anything political.
And yet we go back to the same thing.
And then you act as if you would be the sole discoverer of his work. You don't even mention me once in the book.
Well, I am sorry, but the chapter is about juvenile and not about you.
No, it's not about me, it's about professional honesty. You reference the people who has done the work. You don't just take credit for everything which is not yours. If there is something that really annoys me about people, is that not being honest.
Okay, I have something I have to say to you both.
You cannot possess work intellectually.
There are no social issues in a piece just because you see them there. There's this illusion among curators that everything has to be political or abstract or whatever.
You act as if all we do is just to invent theories out of thin air. The history is real. The art in response to that history is real. The thing with you is that you were perhaps too young to see it, but I can speak of this firsthand because I lived through the social movement of the 1960s. I saw what the movement was about. And it was about deep-rooted issues of class and democracy and the freedom of expression, all of which had an enormous impact on the art produced during and after those events. The problem with you is that you defend the kind of art that caters to a more market-friendly, commonplace entertainment.
Very well, so you speak about personal experience, about how the student movements were transformative to you. Yet, you have taken a tenured position at a university that caters to the most affluent. How do you reconcile the spirit of that with the radical democratization that you defend?
You are making comparison between two things that has
I
nothing
think
to
it is
do with
completely
each other.
related because you were the one who brought up personal experience.
Well,
It's a matter of professional honesty.
Entire career, I have been committed to these ideas. Read my writings. Look at my exhibition essays for the past 25 years. I'm not saying that I'm perfect, but I have always seen myself as somebody whose role is to raise consciousness about social and political issues. What sort of consciousness
Curators
do
are not
you think that you have brought
You're not
forward writings? But you speak about professional honesty as a sort of religious virtue. But a person who is honest about the wrong thing, it doesn't make it right. This is why no one could support you at the University of Clifford.
I don't define what art is, I show it as it is.
No, I won't even bring up your association with commercial galleries, which I see as a huge conflict of interest as a curator. What good is professional honesty if your commitment has been to treat art as an unthreatening and uncritical product, as a happy and pleasurable and entertaining thing to the market?
Why should I apologize if the artists that I work with are successful? That's ludicrous. You, in contrast, treat artists as game pieces of a bogus curatorial hypotheses that try to be a soothing balm to our social problems. Not only does it not work as an exhibitory premises, it's bad art.
It is bad art like you, who just do not wish to think of the world at large.
It's bad art for everyone outside of your circle of friends at Bard.
Just can't do this. What are you doing? No, I'm sorry. It has become a joke. This is not a discussion. This is just a stupid performance.
Okay, so that was your own players. So what happens at the end of the play is that after much back and forth, the characters confess of their own insecurities. You know, Sonia Stillman, who's the art historian, and the other guy, they all confess that how, in a way, their lives are so out of sorts. They did not. It's not even clear at the end whether Joan Mers was a good artist or not. You know, he had ruined everybody's lives for sure. You know? It's a moment of kind of like really questioning themselves about their role in the art world and what's the point of art. The collector takes over and says, you know, it's just art. You know? And then at some point they all leave, with the exception of the young woman who's at the end. And then a theatrical light appears, and the voice unveils definitely that this is a play, finally. And she delivers a monologue where she talks about why she left art making. The character had actually had a very complex relationship with Juvenal Mers. It turns out that she was the author of Juvenal Mers' works. Juvenal Mers was a plagiarist, and she was helping him plagiarize the works. And she was a real artist. She confesses how liberating it was to not be an artist, and how afraid she was to actually be an artist. And she talks about how art hurts you, how art is a very difficult thing to live with, and she cannot live with it. You know? So it ends with that note. I mean, it was written in 2008, in a moment where it felt it was after the Obama election. It was a moment where I think we all felt very out of sorts. It was during the economic downturn. It was this moment of many questions about why are we making art today. So I think to me at least, that was an important piece or project to do that sought to ask those questions. And I know we're out of time, but I do want to end with one piece, because I've talked about a lot of things that are really about fact and fiction, and about performance, and about critique and existing outside. And I mean, I do think that ultimately the work that one produces comes from a very personal place, you know, and that, I mean, that's absolutely been the case for me. I think everything that I do, even though it's not necessarily explicitly about a personal issue, you know, like the Juvenile Project or the Symposium in Mexico City, it does come from particular concerns that I'm going through in a very strong way. And this is just an example of what it means to be outside and to deal also with your biography, your personal biography, which I know I think when you are making or I mean, it was an issue that to me was very important in art school, and I wanted to mention to you. In fact, I will just show one thing before that. Let's see if I can actually find it. When I was going through art school, I wrote a diary every day. Actually, I wrote a diary from when I was 16 till I was 22 or so, every single day. Sometimes I would just write like, something really stupid. Well, actually, I wrote things pretty stupid almost the whole time. But the rule was that I actually had to write every day, and that I had to write something, The other thing that happened was that actually I started writing it to myself, but in the future. So this kind of connects with the first piece I showed you. When I actually had completely forgotten about this until I actually saw the piece. Saw a box at my mom's house one day, and I opened it and I found these diaries that were written almost 20 years ago by me, but me that was kind of another person, and me that was actually younger than me, of course, but that was also older than me in the sense that he lived before me, and all the letters were written to a you. So I had realized that I felt very stupid writing a diary because I didn't know who was writing it for. But the idea that I was writing it to me in the future made sense. And at least it gave me like a sense. Because I did not write it to anybody else, because it was a diary, it was for me. So in the end, that ended up in this novel called The Boy Inside the Letter. It's what you would call a Kunstlerroman, which is an artist novel. It's a novel of artistic education. And to me, it was a very important moment to encounter it and to confront that moment at the time where I realized how I was going through perhaps the most important transition in my life. I think we all go through the most important transition in our lives. When we go from adolescence into adulthood, I really believe that that's really the most important part of our lives. Because that's when we finally know who we are. And also, it's a transition of becoming from an art student to becoming an artist. And in my case, it was also from transitioning from one country to another. These three things were happening at the same time. And, in my diaries were always like, one is like, oh, I'm in love with this girl. Duchamp was an idiot, And the thing is like, oh my God, Duchamp is a genius, And they're like, oh my God, I'm gonna die. She hates me. So what
Mexico City, April 29, 1988.
The installation that was part of the project was essentially it was an interesting challenge to show the drawings from the period that I've made, which also I have happened to keep. I was interested in knowing that many artists actually destroy their artworks when they're 18, And I thought it was interesting to think about it. Because, certainly my artworks were not really anything special or good even. So I showed it like an archaeology museum. So they were not artworks, they were artifacts. So it's essentially a personal archaeology of oneself, with my diaries and with the objects that describe that very critical moment of what was going on with me at the time. And that has continued. I think it's very important, I think in a certain way, to be brutally honest about the moment that you're in, but also have a certain critical distance about what that thing is, so that it's not become just like a confessional piece, and that we really need to ask ourselves, like, why do we need to share this with like thousands of people? Why would anybody care about what we are feeling? I had a similar moment when I actually had a daughter, who I love to death, but it was a really difficult moment for me to actually be a parent. It was not only because I realized that now I had to really behave, be responsible for somebody else being, Before I could just do anything I wanted, it didn't really matter, But now I can't really do that. At the same time, she had just been born, and I was invited to do a performance at Bard College, which is like a very anti-baby place, The last baby place you can imagine, curatorial school, in Annandale, Hudson. Where Sonny Stillman was from. the day of the performance, I was supposed to take care of my daughter, and I didn't know what to do. And then I thought, well, I'm going to bring her, and I'm going to incorporate her in the performance. She was 6 months old. And there is a short story that I think is perhaps the best American short story ever written. I've always felt that. It's Nathaniel Hawthorne's Wakefield. I don't know if you have ever read the story, but I mean, it was a story written, I think, in the 1820s or 1830s, like many, many years ago. And yet, when you read it, it feels completely contemporary. At least like Kafka, you know, like 100 years before its time. Hawthorne was a genius. And that story is incredible. It's like Borges, too. The story is very simple. And it actually, what's most incredible about the story is that he tells you the storyline in the first phrase. And the rest of the story is just developing the whole thing. And it doesn't matter. It's still incredible. And you cannot stop reading. And it's just only 3 or 4 pages long. It's a story of a man named Wakefield who lives with his wife in a house in a little town. One day, they have a completely regular, normal life. One day, Wakefield walks out to run an errand. And then he has some kind of impulse. And he decides to change his path. And he just goes around the block. And he actually decides, for some random reason, to lease a room across the street from his house. And he just moves into the room and starts watching his house, looking what would happen if he's not there. So several hours go by, his wife appears very troubled. Where is he? The entire town starts looking for him. It becomes like a big thing. Days go by, weeks go by, and Wakefield's still in that room, observing what's going on. After several months, his wife starts dressing in black. They think he's dead. And he continues watching. Many months go by, years go by, decades go by, and Wakefield's still there, looking through his window. And one day, many, many years later, when they're both old, Wakefield, also for no apparent reason, decides to leave the room, walks across the street of the house, rings the bell of the house, and his wife, who's an elderly lady, opens the door, and he walks right in. And that's the end of the story. So to me, that story, such a simple action, is so radical. And it's something that we are so afraid of doing all the time. The possibility of saying no, the possibility of breaking patterns, the possibility of suddenly stepping out and doing something that we are not really expected to do. I think that's what it's being an artist. And to me, in that moment of being a parent, I realized it was a lot about the social commitments that we have and how we negotiate those commitments. So I'm just going to conclude by playing you just a few minutes of Wakefield.
In a small apartment near the fireside, an apartment that was previously spoken. He isn't straight next door to his own house, and he isn't destroying his hands. He cannot believe his good fortune, thinking that maybe he was hitherto unperceived indeed, but remembering that at some point he was delayed by the crowds, that he found himself under a bright spotlight, that somebody perhaps was following him, that there were footsteps behind his own, and somebody had muttered his name, that he fancied was his own, that perhaps a dozen possibilities would have followed him and then gone back to his wife to tell him the whole affair. Poor Wakefield. Little knowest thou of thine own insignificance in this world. No human eye or mine is following thee. Go quietly to sleep, good foolish man. And on the morrow, if you might be wise, you should go back to thy wife and tell her the truth. Depart you not from yet a little weak from her chaste bosom, were she for a moment to deem you dead, or lost, or lastingly divided, thou must be woefully conscious of a change in the true wife forever after. It is perilous to make a chasm in human affections, not that they gape so long and wide,
but that they so quickly close.
That's it. Do we take a break? Do we questions? No, I can't. That's fine. So maybe we should turn on the lights. Can we turn on the lights? It usually takes 30 seconds for someone to raise their hand. I'm sorry, what? Yeah. No, right now, this is not on display. It has been on display until a few days ago, actually. But we have to take it down and put it away. But yeah, I'm hoping that actually somebody would basically take on the piece. I mean, I think we'll have to be a museum that would ideally be equipped to supposedly preserve it for that long. That's a game. That's a good question. You know, like the other piece that I showed, the 7 Bridges of Planetsburg, and other pieces that I've done, I find that the game is a wonderful format to say to a group of people, this is not regular life, you know. But that it's not regular life doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. You know, it's simply, this is a different it's a set of rules that we are going to experience together, you know. And also games produce a community, right? Or I mean, even if it's an ephemeral community, if we suddenly start playing soccer, we are a community of players, you know? And it's not a game. I mean, a game is not something where necessarily you win or you lose. There's many games that are simply about experiencing something else, but it's not necessarily. And this is definitely not necessarily the case. So, in a way, it was, to me, I thought, necessary to do something like that, to try to create that structure that you would follow. The name of the piece, by the way, is called Vita per Regula, which is a Latin word called Rules of Life. And it's taken from these Jesuit books manuals that you would, like whenever you became a monk in the Middle Ages, in practically any order in Italy, you would receive a little book that, as a monk, you would need to follow to a T. You would be supposed to dress in a particular way, wake up at a particular time, do these kind of prayers. Like medieval monastic life was incredibly regulated. There was so many things that you needed to do during the day, and they had to be in a particular order as well. And I was very interested in that idea, you know, that you actually that you construct your life in this manner. And the games, we understand that when we play games, you know, we know that these are the rules of the game, you know, and you have to obey these rules. And if you don't obey the rules, then you're out of the game. You know, so you're not supposed to touch the ball with your hand, or you're not supposed to do this or that, and then that's kind of that makes you automatically kind of a pariah, you know, when you're out of it. So I wanted to structure the game to create that sense of community and that sense of adherence to the rules, I suppose, so that the experience could be perhaps more unifying. wish I could help use the art to just, survive financially. I'm not against selling art or in fact engaging with others, which I do actively. And I actually think that as artists, it's unrealistic from society to say, oh, you figure out how to survive, or artists don't really need money, you can live a bohemian life, whatever. Society should support artists, and one way to support artists is, of course, by buying their work, if they make work. I think it is very important. But what happens, though, is that the art market can corrupt you very easily, and financial necessity, which is unfortunate, we all have it, many times ends up kind of dominating and affecting your decisions about what you make. So many times, let's say I make a little piece, that I somehow wanted to make, and then somebody comes and says like, oh, I love this, can you make me 20 of these? And then, so you're faced already with a dilemma. It's like, well, I need money, to make a lot of money, but do I really want to make 20 of these things? And then let's say you make 20, and then somebody else comes and like, oh, I need 200. So then you have stuff becoming an artist. Now you're a factory. You're like a sweatshop or whatever, for one person. But you become commercialized, And you start entering into a very strange gray area that's very difficult to define. It really depends on the person and on the situation. Whether, at what point is the integrity of the work being sacrificed for financial profit? No one can tell you like, oh, this is the dividing line. But everybody can tell you when they have seen it happen to someone. And your work might be sellable and might actually become very desirable and might become very marketable, and you could end up making hundreds of millions of one thing. But when you lose your integrity, when you lose the integrity of the work, that is gone forever. And that has no price. And this is why many artists in history, you can see this all the time, including right now. Artists who were great artists at some point, who start selling and selling and selling, and then suddenly no one can really, no artist, no living or dead artist is capable to produce with the level of brightness and intensity that a current art market demands. So you basically become a factory, and then you become more of like fashion designers. That certainly sells. That can certainly make a lot of money, but this is not something that will gain you recognition, I guess, in the long term. So it's essentially becomes a very personal and private question. In fact, it's really unfortunate what happens when artists are young, when you happen to be your 20s or 20s, whatever, and then suddenly you, quote unquote, make it. And then, let's say a gallery takes you, let's say you start getting invited to hundreds of things to exhibit. And then because we all are very ambitious, or very, we want more and more and more, and we don't know our limits. Especially, I think whenever we have less experience with making art, then you don't know what your limit is, and then you commit to too much, and then you start producing bad work, and then you're in trouble. And then people notice. People notice. It's just like he just wants fame. He just wants attention, and the more fame and the more you actually exhibit, the more the diminishing returns you get, because then you realize that you have become like the flavor of the month, And when you realize it, it's too late. So, anyway, these are kind of some of the patterns that emerge in the art market. But this is not to say that selling art is bad. It's simply arriving at a moment of maturity where you know when you're ready, and that's truly what it means to become a professional artist, to know how much you can produce, how much you can engage with the art market and with other sources of support and funding, which there's many, depending on what you do, in a way that is that gives dignity to your work as an artist, and that it will not sacrifice the things that you believe in. So that's it.
So the art market is a group, that goes down the street, and it's kind of just one of the, let's say, like Mississippi River, it's the art market. You jump in the river, you can watch the river go by. But you spend a lot of time looking at the river, and you spend a lot of time talking about ideas that reflect the river that people jump into it and they decide. How did you get from Mexico City to New York? How did you get, what was the, what motivated you to become that kind of an artist rather than somebody who, I mean, you kind of did the river too, but you spend a lot of time reenacting, so people will get it. Where did that come from?
Good question. Well, the reason why I left Mexico to the US was because I was reading the autobiography of Diego Rivera, and or not autobiography, it was a biography of Diego Rivera called Diego of Montparnasse, which was really about how Diego Rivera went to Paris, And when I was reading it, I kind of had this thing that I have to go, I have to get out. I have to leave so that I can maybe find myself or something. It was a romantic thing, And indeed, my sister was in Chicago, was already studying, and she told, come to Chicago, there's a school there, and so forth. Anyway, so that's why I ended up there. Because I couldn't go to Paris to paint in Montparnasse. 100 years later. So that's what brought me there, But then, ironically, I was interested in making art that had a social message, because I was influenced by murals. Except that, it was in a completely different time and place, and then it took me a long time to understand what it actually meant to do it, many years in that time. And the reason why, to me, the art market is perhaps not the river exclusive. Maybe there's a river called the art market, but I think there's I think the art world is the real place, And I think the art market is part of the art world, but it's not the art world, In other words, I think there's many people who make art outside of what you would call the contemporary art market. And there's, of course, many art markets as well. There's the different kinds of networks. I basically have always been fascinated by how we give meaning to art and how art gets explored and analyzed. And I think it's the background of being an educator too, because you are constantly with people looking at art, giving it value, saying things like, my 4-year-old worked on this, or why is this art? The typical things. And I think I've been always trained to be an observer of attitudes and of reactions and of people. And I think that's what, in a way, has become one of my interests, to depict that set of observations, sometimes through plays, through scripting behaviors and things like that.
So do you think help jumping out of one culture into another culture, because you're all of a sudden an observer whether you want to be or not?
Yeah, I think, there might be something to that. I did, when I arrived to the US, I was an outsider. I was looking at everything from the outside, and I did not understand a lot of it. I eventually became an insider, But at the same time, I think like artists, we all are outsiders all the time. So like, I think being an artist is being an outsider. It's being someone who is constantly looking at the world, you know, as an outside entity. I mean, you look at yourself, you look at all the things, but we're always like these external agents of some kind. It doesn't feel like this, like when we're in art school, because then we all kind of similar and we go to art. But the moment that you step out of it, it's always like, oh, he's the artist. You know, there's like this whole like stigma, right? Being an artist is always being someone crazy, someone eccentric, someone an external person. You do not perform. You know, whenever you say, oh, he's an artist, that's almost like a shorthand for saying, well, you know, he's crazy. You know, he can't possibly ever be like us because he's an artist. He's an artist. So I think that there's a sense of being external that the very practice of being an artist is. But I do think that yes, I always feel keenly aware of how people behave. So sometimes I think that I maybe should not have been an artist. Maybe I should have been an anthropologist. You know?
Well, you kind of love. I mean, you really are maybe someone that can collage without visual reality.
Well,
And what we call an artist today, and what
but you know, yeah. I mean, one thing that has always interested me was precisely because you know, in society, let's say mainstream society looks at art with a series of stereotypes. There's like all these stereotypes when you think about art. Not from the inside, they all but from the outside. I feel that there's a lot of misunderstandings of what making art is about, and I'm interested in finding out. And I think a lot of things that I do, like in the juvenile players, for example, I mean, you saw this section that is kind of funny and you know, perhaps, but I try to give a lot of dignity to these characters. I mean, to me, it was not really about creating a caricature. It was really more about trying to find the humanity in all these people. You know, the art historian, who she is kind of really interested. She doesn't really believe that art has a social function. Right? Or the guy who's working at Brighton who said, you know, of course art should make money. Why not? You know, what's the problem with that? But like every human being, it's full of contradictions too. You know, but we rarely, like for example, in theater. And I did my research on this, you know, there was like absolutely no play that I could find that actually spoke about the art world from the inside. You know, it was always, whenever it was a play about the art world, it's like always the artists are presented as deranged or stupid or like ridiculous, you know. Maybe the only exception is a film by Miranda July, which she went to art school, Learning to Love More. What's it called? Sorry, what's the name of the film? Does anybody know that film by Miranda July? I think it's me, you, her, and everybody else. Yeah, is it there? Anyway, but there's very few. Maybe it's some examples of film, but like that internal book about art making is difficult to find. So I'm interested in that whole understanding the art making community.
How many people were in the audience of the digital piece?
Well, we had come out maybe an audience like 70 people or so, 70 or 80 people. It was like the Kansas City scene. Yes, of course. Well, at the end, you have to get it, you know, because you know at the end. I mean, some people figure out toward the middle that something obviously was up, you know. But at the end, you know, it's designed to actually show you, you know, because the capture the lighting, you know, it definitely has. You have to know. And in that case, you know, with exception, in contrast to the Mexico City panel, there I really didn't find it necessary to really continue pretending. You know, it actually was important to actually do something very evident that told him, this is a play. You know, you're looking at a play. Like, and I was interested in kind of like creating this sense of this experience where you're looking at something and suddenly you realize that it's not what you thought it was. Yeah. So that was kind of like one of the goals of the play, to show you that it had that kind of, it was a moving target.
In Mexico, the argument is not in people that was paid, and you never heard that.
I never ended up reviewing it. That's very mean, right? Yeah, I mean, now when I talk about it, I'm happy to acknowledge it. But the thing, one thing I thought was, we have photographs and we have other text. I mean, the other thing that I thought, or at the time, and I still believe it so now, like, people didn't really realize it. Maybe they don't deserve to know.
Yeah, that's true.
You know? But I think it's like, at what point you serve everything on a silver platter? You know? And would it even matter the person realized it was false? You know? So to me, the piece was really about putting these ideas out there and see what would happen. You know, and what would be the reaction? Force a reaction, force to say things as they are. You know? Well,
and not so much for the audience, but especially for the community.
Tough luck. No, I mean, like really, like they were participating in a symposium to purify culture. I mean, like, well, give me a break. You know, I mean, it was like unbelievable to me. I mean, I couldn't believe it. They were participating. I mean, but yes, it's true. I mean, like if you get very righteous about a thing, yeah, it was really bad. But I felt it was necessary. I thought it was a necessary price. I mean, I was willing to take the heat, for it because I felt it was necessary. Well, I mean, it goes back to this question raised here about being an outsider. It's also been interesting for me now that I've been away for many years that I could come back, and then I do now see things in ways that the people there do not see them. You know, so I do think that people do have a certain privilege. I mean, the sadness perhaps of living in self-imposed exile, yes, or being a permanent person who is kind of in between places forever, is that you lose the ability to really feel completely connected to one place, But what you gain is that ability to see it with a certain kind of clarity that others inside of it cannot see it. So in a way that was a way in which I felt I could contribute to it. I mean, it's very sad for me that I spent so many years away from it, but that's also what brings me back to wanting to do things there. And I also find it very stimulating because I always, of course, suggest people to travel and to do our work everywhere else. And I think as an art student, usually my main recommendation is that you do everything you can to get out of where you are and go anywhere else and try to make art somewhere else. You know, and I don't mean just like summer program, you know, but really like try to go to another country and try to experience life as an artist there. You know, like try to do shows there, because you learn a lot about who you are. You learn a lot about other audiences, about how, for example, references that for people here will be very immediate and simple and direct. In other places will be completely foreign. You know, and then you learn how it really changes. Your work changes, and your work will change. And I think that's a very important lesson for an artist, you know, to constantly be challenged by different environments, and then also you become very inspired by them. You know, you start valuing the things in the place that you left. And I do that all the time, and I value the things that are here, that are happening here, when I go there, and the other way around. It's not just about being critical. It's about appreciating things as well. But then you're still learning also. Like for example, I did a project a few years ago in Italy, which was very. It was really like a collaborative project. It was a community project in the city of Bologna, and at the beginning it was very difficult because in the city of Bologna there were all these artists who were my age or older, who looked at me with an evil eye, you know. They were kind of like, who the hell are you? What are you doing here in my city? And who are you to do this project? And what do you know about our city? And you will never, ever know what this place is about, you know. And true, perhaps I will never have the kind of knowledge that they have. But by the fact that I'm different, you can always bring something new. And things like, we are people everywhere. You know, like people, there's men, there's women, there's love, there's hate, there's like gossip, there's, you know, there's employees, there's bosses, there's poor people, there's rich people. I mean, we're not that different. We're not like Martians. You know, I mean, things are not that different, really. And the way people look at art is really not that different. You know, that's kind of one of my lessons too. You know, just humanity is true everywhere, and the more you travel and the more you see things, you know, the more you realize how we are really connected as human beings. You know? I don't know if that's...
Thank you so much.
Okay, I just wanted to mention very quickly about the project in Kent Fine Art that Lysla mentioned. Yeah, it will be 2 minutes. Everybody else, this is the current project that is right now in Kent Fine Art. It's a used Spanish bookstore in New York City. It's actually the only used Spanish bookstore in New York. In New York, you may know, but there's 2 million Spanish speakers. That's a quarter of the entire population. And there's no Spanish bookstores. I miss the used bookstore. I am a big book buyer. I'm a biblio maniac, bibliomaniac, or whatever it is. And I wanted to really recreate the space of the used bookstore, which, you know, it's also disappearing everywhere. You know, the used bookstores is a bad business, and it's very difficult to make it survive. And in Mexico City, there's a street still full of used bookstores. They're really wonderful places where you go there, and there's thousands and thousands of books, which are worth, they're sold for practically nothing. They're really wonderful. There's also a precedent that in the 20s, Mexican poet Juan Tablada tried to open a bookstore in the 20s in Chelsea, and it kind of was a disaster, you know. And I always thought about that. What I did is I went to Mexico and I exchanged my work for books. For every 60 books, I will give them a small working paper, people. And it started small. You know, I thought I would never gather enough books to make a bookstore. You know, I had like 50 books. You know, it was like never gonna make it. Went to a newspaper and I really asked them to write a story. They did write a story, and then it was like an avalanche of people that started making books. families, teachers, professors, retired lawyers, children with their children's books, people who have never heard of Met, people from all over the country started sending books, people writing cars full of books. It was unbelievable. I mean, within 3 weeks, we accumulated 25,000 books. So I still have a friend of mine really angry at me because I'm still full of books. But however, we did actually have shipped already half the books, which are at Kent, the gallery. And this is the radio service. Basically, we have 60 categories of books. We have anthropology, archaeology, sociology, history. I can guarantee you this is the best collection of historical Spanish books anywhere in New York. It's really incredible. Religion, cooking, sports, sex, drugs, horror novels. I mean, anything you can possibly imagine is there. But to me, it's really like about creating the social space of reading and about the object of the book as something very, very special. Each book actually has an ex libris, which is like the identifier of the previous owner, the name of the person. To me, it's very important that people know who it belongs to. So you can come and you can buy a book. It's pay what you wish. You can give a cent, but the money goes to a local organization that promotes literacy in Spanish. So the idea of the project, so we've been doing a lot of social events at the space, and we've been there for 2 months. Friday is the last day, the last event we have. And we're going to go now on a tour around the US to present the bookstore, and my goal is to bring it back to New York next year, at the end of next year, to find a permanent location for it, to exist. And it's really a labor of love. To me, it's more than another project. It's really a cause to really expand the perception of what Spanish and the culture around Spanish is. That is really more, especially Latin culture, that is more about music, it's more than about salsa and merengue. It's really about thousands and hundreds of thousands of things written in every field of human knowledge, which you will never find in Google, which you will never find online, which are out of print, and also that are as objects very beautiful and very interesting to have, very different from the ebook. So I really, if you have a chance, I would love for you to come and see the project and join us in the closing event on Friday. Thank you so much.